Hello, this is Wiley Edmonds again, and this is lecture number 2 in this 8 lecture series that is entitled The Great Doctrines of the Bible. This lecture is entitled The Mystery of God's Redemptive Plan Revealed. Actually, no sooner had the dust settled on man's expulsion from Eden than Satan ruthlessly and relentlessly swung his angelic army into full force in order to prevent man from finding the corridor that would lead toward reconciling a relationship with the eternal God. And Satan, the brilliant strategist that he is, he picked up immediately on God's pronouncement that the seed of woman would someday bruise his head. And that was about as close as the eternal God ever came to showing his hand relative to his grand eternal plan. This plan was crafted by an omnipotent God and preordained before creation to qualify and grant a remnant an eternal heritage, according to Matthew 7:14. And it was never intended to be a temporary and superficial antidote, nor an ad hoc solution to an eternal problem. From simple beginnings, the young family of Adam and Eve began rapid expansion. Actually, according to first century historian Flavius Josephus, he even had 33 sons and 23 daughters. Jealousy and sibling rivalry among their children, all instigated by the master manipulator, Satan himself, become a natural order. Hatred, deceit, and murder seamlessly found their way into the family unit, edifying the sinful, fallen nature of Earth's newest inhabitants. Just as the wild nature is inherent in the animals of the field, so is the Adamic sinful nature inherent in every human. Human babies don't have to learn to lie to get what they want. It's automatic. It's called inborn sin. The fall of Adam endowed the human being with a full regiment of fallen frailties. The Minnesota Crime Commissioner has said it best, and I quote, "Everybody starts life as a little savage. He is completely selfish and self-centered. He wants what he wants, and when he wants it. It may be his bottle or his mom's attention, his playmates' toys, and you deny him what he wants, and he seethes with rage and aggression, which would be murderous were he not so little and helpless. He is dirty, without morals, knowledge, or skills." This means that all children, not just certain children, are all born delinquents. And if permitted to continue in that self-centered world of their infancy, and given free rein to his impulsive actions to satisfy his wants, every child would grow up to be a thief or a killer, a rapist, or simply an anarchist. End quote. Discipline and integrity, which are essential for salvation, must be learned from a very early age. Discipline promotes adherence to social norms, responsibility, and consistency in being able to pursue goals. And integrity involves honesty and moral principles, fostering trust and respect. Now, these traits underpin a stable society that values ethical behavior, driving progress and upholding societal values. Psychologists tell us that these traits must be ingrained into a child's psyche before they reach the age of 6 in order for it to become a lifelong trait. Now, we as the children of God must learn early on that following God's guidance requires a disciplined walk of faith. God reveals his plan step by step, providing information only as needed. And this is often spoken of as need to know. Now, unlike the patriarchs of old, we are privileged to have the Bible as our guide for daily living. Satan always projected his own ideas into anticipating God's plan of action. His first mission was to taint the bloodline of the woman's descendants with the intent of rendering it impossible to carry the pure genome of the original man. And now, once the bloodline became defiled, tainted with the satanic genome, then nothing could stop him from regaining total control of the earth again. Hardly 500 years had passed until Satan initiated otherworldly events. This occurrence was so dramatic that it reached the outer limits of human imagination. The account of this story is so sensational that it becomes the essence of science fiction. It's for this very reason that it is almost always completely omitted from biblical narratives. The third chapter of Genesis places Satan in the Garden of Eden before humanity fell. The 28th chapter of Ezekiel places Satan in the garden at the time of the fall. Both of these passages point towards Satan's pre-human fall. If you will, reference the explanation from my first lecture of the thousands, actually probably more likely millions of Luciferian spiritual forces that we loosely call angels, that was cast out of heaven and consigned to the earthly realm. And we can deduce from the context of the scripture that in the 12th chapter of Revelation that this spiritual renegade force constituted a third of the heavenly angelic host. And now, while they were stripped of the cloak of the glories of the heavenlies and banned from any interaction with the inner circle of God's holy sanctum, they had and still have the ability to interact with mankind. As recorded in the 6th chapter of Genesis, an incursion of these renegade satanic angels were attracted by the beauty of the daughters of Adam and Eve's descendants. This indicated that they left heaven and manifested flesh upon themselves for the express purpose of taking for themselves wives of the Adamic race. The offspring of this union would produce a new race of hybrid entities of gigantic stature. These offspring were typically classified as demigods. They were endowed with superhuman strength, endurance, and possessing otherworldly knowledge. By this time, only a small part of the Earth's population showed any interest at all in worshiping God. It is possible that the Earth's population had reached nearly 1 billion people by this time. And detailed account of this incursion can be found in the extra-biblical book of Enoch. Now, this book from the 4th century BC gives a lot of detailed information. This narrative was sourced from ancient Jewish literature and traditional stories that was found in the Oral Torah and ancient Hebrew writings that date back to the time of Solomon and the First Temple period. This text is referenced and alluded to 3 times in the New Testament. Historical records indicate that it was commonly read as literature and accepted by the educated before and during the 1st century AD. Now, the Bible is all truth. All truth is not in the Bible. It must, however, be emphatically stated that the Bible must always be the baseline of all truth. In other words, everything must parallel with Bible teaching. Any teaching that runs askew of biblical perspectives must be categorized as spurious at least and disassociated from scriptural truth. The book of Enoch does, however, fill in some basic blanks that exist in the 6th chapter of Genesis. We find Satan allowing at least 200 of his angels to take flesh on themselves and cohabit with human women, which produced a corrupted offspring with tainted DNA, thus rendering them incapable of producing a pure mitochondria exact species. The intent was to corrupt the complete Adamic genome, making it impossible for the woman to bear a seed that was capable of bruising the head of Satan. Now, this fallen angel-human union produced a hybrid of a superhuman sire, called by Moses the Nephilim. The word was translated to mean giants. This race of giants, bearing superhuman abilities, was referred to by Jude, the brother of our Lord Jesus, in his reference to the book of Enoch, relative to the sin of the fallen angels. This incursion was allowed by God to exist and fester, unabated for over 1,000 years, inflicting virtually the entire human race, with the exception of Noah and his wife and 3 sons. Now, the earth is prolific with evidence of this incursion, with a race of supernatural beings. No, they weren't immortal, but archaeologists Spade reveal that these giants were commonly in excess of 20 feet in height, devouring everything the earth produced. They possessed the knowledge of the universe, including science, math, astrology, and engineering. These giants were more than capable of building the megaliths of the stone culture throughout the world that are defiant of human frailty, both in intellect and mastery. After all, they were the offspring of the superhuman angelic heritage. Unfortunately, the bias of science, religion, and archaeology have kept this truth hidden for centuries. This information was common knowledge centuries before the Common Era. This information has been readily available for centuries for anyone who cared to seek it out. But since it was so far beyond the understanding of Middle Ages Christianity, and it did not comport with the religious belief system of the time, it was deemed taboo and sacrilegious just to entertain the idea. Even today, the average person would rather believe these undeniable evidentiary monuments of incredible magnitude were designed and built by space aliens, ancient aliens from outer space. The undeniable evidence is massive that they were built by a race of giant Luciferian demagogues during the antediluvian period in total defiance of the eternal God. Finally, God stepped in and brought about the great deluge, which we commonly call the flood. And this catastrophic event destroyed this diabolical generation of Luciferian monsters. The earth's population had become so saturated with this deviant bloodline that only one righteous man named Noah and his family were deemed untainted. Nothing less than total annihilation would be sufficient to cleanse this cancer from the face of the earth. Now, after the flood and with the bloodline of Adam and the original creation secure, Satan, the master of the earth, goes right back to work on his next phase of deterrence and undermining what he believes to be the eternal God's next move. It's not totally clear, although somewhat obvious, how the gigantism genome, though much reduced in strength, later cropped up again in the generations of Noah's son Ham. This genome was manifested through a race of giants associated with Noah's grandson Canaan, known as the Canaanites, and continued to be a menace for the Israelites. In fact, it wasn't until the time of David, 1,500 years later, that these giants were completely eliminated. Satan would like nothing better than for his colossal failure to be eliminated from human history. Unfortunately, the Christian church has been implicit in helping him to do just that. The survivors of the great flood, Noah with his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives, began generation building, teaching and instructing their offspring in the righteous ways of God. It seems that they met with relatively little success, however. Shem, the father of the Hebrews, kept the flame of truth alive for 600 years, and he overlapped the life of Adam by over 100 years. Within a century after the flood, the worship of other gods became prominent. None other than Nimrod, great-grandson of Noah and grandson of Ham, became a mighty one in the earth and architect of the Tower of Babel, which became a powerful pivot point in ancient history. Actually, it's so powerful indeed that much of it still influences religious belief 42 centuries later. In fact, it's been so prevalent in tradition that you probably recently celebrated his birthday and didn't even know it. All of this is indicative of the extent to which Satan has gone to create a scenario for an optional counterfeit religion in which he can shoehorn mankind into an alternate perception of God's creation. Now, if I were Satan, I would establish a religion using many of the forms and symbols, maybe even a lot of the dogma of the genuine faith. I would obfuscate the office of priest or pastor and turn it into a powerful hierarchy. I'd even make the pinnacle to be a vicar of God. And I'd certainly take their authoritative scripture and translate it into a form which looks like the original, but with enough deviations to deceive all but the closest adherents to the real faith. I would commingle the original feast and holy days with the rituals and pagan practices of the idolatrous heathen worshippers. And I'd even be so smart as to even align some of them with the same days and rename them with an acceptable sounding alternative. I'd make sinful living acceptable. I'd make a form of penance profitable to the hierarchy, but still affordable to the masses. I would, in effect, make the sin problem go away, and I'd soothe the conscience of the sinner. And that is exactly what Satan has done as an answer to God's salvation plan. So now, looking at all of this, it was God's plan to deal with the sin problem. Until it's resolved, the earth remains under the curse of death and annihilation. What is the basic premise of this equation? God is the life source. Sin is neither negotiable nor reconcilable, and it incurs a debt that must be paid. Sin requires a death penalty, and God cannot merely in his mercy forgive it until the demands of justice have been met. The concept of blood sacrifice for sin was deeply ingrained into the Jewish faith, literally stretching back to the times fresh out of Eden. And in order to comprehend why God requires a blood sacrifice, we have got to delve into the theological and symbolic dimension of the practice as is depicted in the Bible. And Isaiah chapter 65 and verse 5 denotes sin as an abhorrent, acrid stench in the nostrils of God. It is so seriously repugnant to a righteous and holy God that it requires a blood sacrifice to demonstrate the seriousness of sin. The Bible declares that the life of the flesh is in the blood. Leviticus 17:11. Blood and life are synonymous. Innocence must shed its blood, literally its life factor, to provide the covering for sin. At the heart of the biblical narratives lies the concept of sin, understood as rebellion against God's moral law. That's according to Exodus 21 through 17, and then again in 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. And a rupture in the relationship between humanity and its creator. Romans 3:23. Sin manifests in various forms, including disobedience, injustice, and moral corruption. It unequivocally leads to estrangement from God and spiritual death. Romans 6:23. Now, thankfully, God provided a way through the animal sacrificial system, according to Genesis 3:21, that literally provided a temporary covering, a system of paying the interest on the debt, if you will. Annually, through the sacrificial system, they were required to pay the interest and roll the principal forward. Now, over the course of the next 2,000 years, from Abraham to Calvary, God slowly, incrementally, and systematically streamlined and ramped up the blood sacrificial structure. Beginning with the establishment of the law and the Levitical order at Sinai, God ordained and put into place the very backbone of his relationship with man, known as the seven feast system. The seven feast system embodied and capsulized within it the complete program for his purpose of bringing about the consummation of this broken relationship. Though followed with varying degree of intensity for 1,500 years, both Satan and the chosen people saw this feast system as an end in itself. They saw it as just a systematic way to engage routinely and ceremonially in paying tribute to their God. But they did not realize that they were, in effect, only paying the interest on the sin debt. They had no hint of how God would manifest to them a way to repay the principal. Throughout the nearly 800-year period of the judges and then the monarchy and on through the exile and beyond, never once was the mystery ever realized. Both Satan and all of humanity were blinded to the truth that this would later be revealed in the feast system. According to Isaiah 6:10 and reiterated again in John 12:40, they were purposely blinded, it says, so that their eyes could not see and their mind could not understand. And there's a reason for that. Annually, the seven feasts became irrefutably routine and just another required religious holiday. They saw it as a celebration and remembrance of ancient manifestations of a remote God. No one, neither the prophets nor their religious leaders, grasped the reality that they were only rehearsals, and it epitomized the future fulfillment of God's promise that he made to Eve in the Garden of Eden. Even the prophets, in their prophecies of the Messiah coming to dwell among them, or the prophecies of his suffering and utter rejection, made that connection. Through victory and grandeur and triumph, as well as suffering, the pathos of defeat, disgrace, and humiliation. The Israelites' recognition of God likewise waxed and waned, usually with a lot more wane than wax. After the building of the temple by Solomon in 962 BC, they coalesced to a much greater degree into a much more organized and formal type of worship. They followed to a greater degree the Mosaic law that's recorded in the Torah, in what became the first 5 books of our Old Testament. While in Babylonian exile, 606 to 536 BC, following the Mosaic law and rules of animal sacrifice and the observance of holy days, it was meaningfully impossible for the Jews to keep it. They, through the process of many years, particularly during the post-monarchy period of the exile, and they began to recognize their religion as Judaism. Originally, most of their religious activities were almost completely followed out of oral tradition. It wasn't long after the destruction of Solomon's temple in 586 BC and deep into their Babylonian exile Did the rabbis see the need of a written compendium to create the rules and guidelines for their worship and religious engagement? What is known as the Babylonian Talmud began with a collection of Jewish thought and aspirations, and it served as a guide for the daily life of the Jews. And it contains much of the oral law, and it's an authoritative collection of exegetical material, and it's very open to interpretation. During the 2nd century BC, under the Hasmoneans' rule, various religions factors emerged, three of them which you're very familiar with: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes. They're all of particular interest. I'm not going to delve into their particularities because they bear really no relevance to the theme of this lecture, only to note that during the period of the Second Temple from 515 BC to 70 AD, which included the time of Christ, their rules had become very burdensome and very rigid, taking authority over every facet of Jewish life. You've probably noticed that in the Gospels, Jesus often became afoul of the Jews' arbitrary rules of conduct. For over 400 years, without a prophet, the Jewish people followed a ritualistic religious system and perfunctorily celebrated their annual feast. For the Jews, these feasts commemorated their nation's beginnings in the law giving of Moses at Sinai during their exodus from Egyptian bondage. It was here at Sinai that the plan of salvation began to be unfolded. This blueprint for redemption, designed to rescue humanity from the sentence of eternal death, commenced as an enigmatic mystery. Neither mankind nor Satan could discern the profound implications embedded within God's covenant. The first phase of the plan was hidden in plain sight in the Feast of the Passover. While commemorating the release of the children of Israel of Egypt from Egyptian bondage, it was religiously celebrated, including every explicit detail. God required that it was always to be reenacted annually and without deviation on the predesignated date and time. Prophetically, it was designed to anticipate the event that would fully repay the principal debt, rather than acting as another annual interest installment to defer the principal. Jesus, the incarnate Son of God, would step in and, by paying with his own blood, provide debt repayment for every person on earth, with only one caveat. You have to claim the debt exemption. Every person must come to Jesus for himself and ask to be forgiven of his sin, and therefore making application to automatically become a registered blood-bought child of God. I'm reminded that as a lad down on the farm, my father often raised hogs. And out in the middle of his hog pasture, there's a great big old oak tree. And I usually just called it an acorn tree. But I used to watch those hogs gathering under that tree to eat those acorns. They'd grunt with great satisfaction as they munched on that wonderful supply from above. But interestingly, they never once looked up to see where that manna was coming from. They enjoyed and they feasted to their heart's content without concern or interest in the source of the provision. Interestingly, that seems to be a portrait of mankind throughout the ages, feasting on the bountiful riches provided to us as the children of God, without regard to the price that was paid to secure our eternal hope. I thank you, and this is the end of Lecture 2.